Lecture 35, Reagan, Hollywood, and American Ideals.
Art and literature have always been the way by which the higher truths of mythology have been conveyed. From the oral poetry of Gilgamesh, Homer, through the written word of the Alexander romance, right on up to truly great books like the Morte d'Arthur, with its story of the Holy Grail. And then, as printing became more available, not just magnificent works of art and literature, but also cheap works. We talked about in our study of Virgil the Magician, the chapbook, the cheap book that was sold with bad printing, bad paper, bad illustrations, but to an ever larger circle of readers who wanted pulp fiction. And in America of the 19th century, these dime novels, as they were called, had an almost unlimited audience. And the frontier was the most favored subject. The stories of Davey Crockett. Crockett himself was quite a self-promoter, and he brought out a cheap almanac, sort of like Benjamin Franklin's almanac, but this was Davey Crockett's almanac, and it had the information farmers needed about when to plant crops and full moon and so on, but it also was filled with stories about Davey, how he could grin a bear to death or grin a raccoon out of a tree. So these chapbooks celebrated Davy Crockett, they celebrated Jesse James, and they were devoured by the Americans living in cities like New York and Boston. And one reason why the railroads and banks were so determined to get Jesse is that they transformed him into a national hero. These chapbooks did, these dime novels, and so too General Custer. And he took a hand in promoting a number of these chapbooks. The most successful of all of these frontiersmen, however, was Buffalo Bill. He was a real frontier boy, grew up in Iowa, joined the 1st Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, and then after the war gained his name by that slaughter of the buffaloes. That was conscious government policy. It wasn't just to feed the railroad workers. It was, as General Sheridan said, it's destroying the enemy, it's destroying the Indians' commissary. It was intentionally done to starve the Indians. But Buffalo Bill decided he wasn't going to die broke, and he created his Wild West show. And you can still visit his farm and ranch in Nebraska, or stay in Sheridan, Wyoming, in the hotel where he would reside while he interviewed candidates for his Wild West show, touring the world. And he grew old and famous and wealthy. So the frontier was fundamental to American values. And as the 20th century dawned, the frontier became the staple of Hollywood. Indeed, one of the first motion pictures ever made, though I think made in New Jersey, not Hollywood, was The Great Train Robbery. And for the most of the 20th century, cowboy and Indian films, cavalry films, shootouts at dawn on the streets of a lonely Texas town, this became the favorite form of conveying the myths of America, the myths of the frontier, and the myths that all Americans held dear. Davy Crockett, 1955, he emerged from relative obscurity to becoming probably the most famous historical figure in America. Walt Disney did that for him. And craze swept the nation of coonskin caps and the song. He went to Washington, so we hear tell, patched up the crack in the Liberty Bell. Davy Crockett, king of the wild frontier. Or the last scene in the Alamo. There he is standing, Mexicans swarming all around him, clubbing them with his rifle, and the song, "His land is biggest and his land is best." And a few years later, John Wayne made a movie about the Alamo, and I'm sure critics didn't like it. But to those who study Davey Crockett pretty carefully, John Wayne gives an excellent performance of how Crockett really was. And in a remarkable scene, he talks to Travis about why he has come to fight at the Alamo. He wants to see a republic in Texas. And republic, John Wayne says, that's the kind of word that gives a lump to your throat, the kind of lump you feel when your boy takes his first steps. I don't see how you can convey more beautifully the higher truth of freedom. And Duke just invented his own way of how Davy died. And at the end, he takes a torch, throws it into the powder magazine of the Alamo, and blows it up. And Custer, his image will be forever shaped by Errol Flynn. Now, for a drunkard and a womanizer who did his best to avoid any kind of military service, Errol Flynn made a remarkable number of heroic movies. And they died with their boots on, with Olivia de Havilland as his wife is magic, pure magic. And Jesse James. Why, two of Hollywood's leading men of the time, Henry Fonda and Tyrone Power, played Jesse and Frank. And the end had this scene with the newspaper editor giving a eulogy over Jesse's grave and saying, now Jesse was an outlaw. Jesse stole to give to the poor. Jesse killed, though I don't think he ever killed anyone who didn't deserve it. And he was the rip-roaringest, dang-golliest, bustin' buckaroo that you ever saw. So, Hollywood. But these films conveyed good values. And if we're to take the American values of Hollywood in its golden years of the 30s and 40s and 50s, they were, one, America is the land of freedom. And America has taken up the burden to bring freedom to the world. America is the best country in the world because it is the freest. Its economy is free, its people are free. Oh, sure, government gets corrupt from time to time, but Mr. Deeds will go to Washington and he'll fix it up, just the way Davy patched up the crack in the Liberty Bell. That Americans do not look for a fight, but when they find one, they finish it. And they do their duty to the very end. They believe in truth, justice, and the American way, to quote the slogan of one of our superheroes. Truth, justice, and the American way. Now, in that movie, in one of Errol Flynn's movies, actually the Santa Fe Trail, General Custer, a young Lieutenant Custer, is played by Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was a president who believed in those values of America, because this was not Hollywood myths. These were the values of ordinary good Americans, believing their country was unique. And these were the values that Ronald Reagan grew up with, that he believed in, that he performed in his movies, and that he conveyed into the presidency at one of the most difficult times in our country's history. 1960, John Kennedy was inaugurated. He gave one of the most moving inaugural addresses in our country's history. Go read it there in Arlington National Cemetery, where his eternal flame burns. That we will bear any burden, we will pay any price. Let the word go out to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation, and we will pay any price for freedom. Then began our national nightmare. November the 22nd, 1963, President Kennedy assassinated. How could that be? How could he be shot dead in an American city? So handsome, so youthful, Why was he murdered? Then President Johnson. He was a superb manipulator of the Senate when he was a senator, found it more difficult as a president. He followed Franklin Roosevelt, believed deeply in the New Deal, and set out to conquer poverty, build a great society, put a man on the moon. But he found all of this ultimately impeded by a war in a far-off place, Vietnam. But he took seriously this pledge that we would pay any price. But increasingly, the American people did not want to pay that price for a war that he could not explain to them, to a war that seemed to be assisting only a corrupt government. And the violence, the protest began to a degree that was unimaginable in 1960. Until by 1968, cities in this country, like Los Angeles, were in flames. Detroit, Boston. How could this be? Radical students, not like the clean-cut students of the 50s or even early 60s, long beards, long hair, not taking baths, took over the greatest universities in our country, like Harvard, like Columbia. And weak-kneed professors caved into them. If a professor tried to give an ordinary lecture on, let's say, the reign of Augustus, he would be shouted down, or she would be shouted down. Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh. And then chastised by his colleagues for not engaging his students in the relevant discussions about the evil of the war in Vietnam. And in 1968, and I'm just saying this, having gotten us into this mess, President Johnson then would not run for a second term, challenged by Robert Kennedy. And then when it seemed as though Robert Kennedy, who had a large base of support, was going to win not just the nomination, but the presidency, suddenly, under the most mysterious circumstances, which we still today do not understand, he was shot dead as he was passing through the kitchen of a Los Angeles hotel. What would happen next? Well, what happened next was Richard Nixon. He became president, and for a while, Americans thought he would bring peace and order back to this country. And he started bold foreign policy initiatives, recognizing China, negotiating with the Soviet Union, promising to end the war in Vietnam, but in fact escalating it until his bombing raids on Cambodia set off the wildest demonstrations yet on college campuses. And Americans watched in horror on television as their own soldiers shot down American boys and girls. Where would it end? Well, it would end for President Nixon with Watergate. And here was the sign of a president lying to us on television. He stepped down. Gerald Ford, whom I admire more and more, took over the presidency, told us the national nightmare was over. But the press just took a dislike to him. He was probably the most athletic man ever to be president. They turned him into a stumblebum, and he lost to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter may have meant well, but our economy collapsed, double-digit inflation, and our foreign policy. Why, 2 million Cambodians were murdered by a communist government. And the domino effect that some had laughed at seemed real enough as Cambodia, Laos, and all of Vietnam became communist. And we were so weak that sacred American soil, our consulate in Tehran, was taken over, and Americans held as hostages. And we were unable to do anything, it seemed. Jimmy Carter sent in a helicopter expedition that crashed in the sands. And it was at this moment, 1980, when our fortunes may have been as low as they have ever been, and American confidence in our country, in our leaders, may have been at an all-time low, that Ronald Reagan became president. Well, the savior of America in 1860 had come out of Illinois, inexperienced, and so too Reagan came from Illinois originally. Born in Tampico, growing up in Dixon, Illinois. His father was a high-spirited, drinking a little bit salesman, and the mother was devoted to her sons and a devoted Christian. There were two of them. There was a little boy, Moon, nicknamed by his father for a comic strip character, and there was Ronald, but he was always called Dutch. That's the name his dad gave him, and because, one, he was fat, and two, there was a paint company that had as its logo a little Dutch boy with a square haircut, square bangs, the way Mrs. Reagan cut Ronald's hair. So he was Dutch, and Dutch went to high school, served as a lifeguard on the river there in Dixon. And he later said he had rescued 77 people, and I believe him. Went to Eureka College, one of those good, solid, liberal arts colleges that have educated so many fine Americans. Played football. Then, when he graduated, it was in the very depths of the Depression. Reagan, throughout his life, admired Franklin Roosevelt. As president, he stated, "It is not my purpose to end the New Deal. I mean to end the Great Society." And he forever remembered that when his father was out of work, he got a job with the WPA, and that put food on the table. Reagan was a Democrat in those days, and he was ambitious. He wanted to be on the air. He wanted to be a newsman, and he wanted to be a sports broadcaster. He drove around Iowa, out of Illinois, around Iowa. Jobs were almost impossible to find in this graduation year of 1932 for him. But the University of Iowa hired him to broadcast some of their football games at $10 a game. But he went over to Des Moines and went to the new radio station there, and they said, "Do you have any experience?" He said, "Well, I've been broadcasting the University of Iowa games." "Yeah, but I mean, it's all different here. You don't do live broadcasting. It's baseball season now, and what we get is a telegraph that says, X got a hit, and you've got to fill in all between. And can you do that? Because we need a sports broadcaster. We just fired ours for being drunk." "Sure, I can do it. And let me tell you, I'll give you a play-by-play analysis of our game against Western Teachers last year." He did. And he was hired on the spot. He was doing a good job, known over a good part of Iowa and Illinois as Dutch Reagan. Then he got the idea, well, why don't I go to Hollywood? But he couldn't pay for it on his own, and went to his boss and said, "Why don't I go out and during the spring training season to Los Angeles with the Chicago Cubs and cover that?" So he did. And while there, he went into the Hollywood studios. Well, they were looking for some upcoming actors. Good-looking, handsome man, big. In fact, it is said that Margaret Thatcher, when she had her first dinner at the White House with Ronald Reagan, went back to her room and her husband said, "Well, you've just had dinner with the President of the United States." And she said, "Oh no, I've had dinner with the most handsome man in the world." So handsome, and did very well on his screen test. So he was hired, put on contract. But what was his name going to be? Dutch Reagan. No, that doesn't work. You've got to change your name. You got any ideas? No? Is Dutch your real name? "Oh, no, my real name is Ronald Reagan." Ronald Reagan, that's okay. And his first movie was about a newscaster. Now you'll hear that he made B-grade movies, and he never denied they were budget. They weren't looking for good, he said. They were looking for it being done by Thursday. But a lot of them are good movies, and they convey these good values. One of his favorite was King's Row, in which he is amputated, his legs are amputated by an evil doctor. And when told about it, instead of letting that break him, he said, "What does he think I do, live in my legs?" So that's the American overcoming any trauma. During the war, he served very ably making movies, propaganda films for the Army, and then came back to Hollywood. He had married before the war to the actress Jane Wyman, and that marriage was coming apart, and he didn't seem to get the roles he wanted. But he made very good films in that post-war period down until 1954. And he took on some bold roles. Epilepsy was so taboo in Hollywood that seizures could not be shown, the word could not be used. And he made one of the first films to, in the most sympathetic terms, see what a person with epilepsy goes through, Night unto Night. And my favorite, well, I suppose it would be the earlier movie, Knute Rockne, All-American, when he plays George Gipp. And he's a great football player. Father Knute Rockne and his wife are fond of him. And he's dying, though, of pneumonia. And he says to the coach, "Coach, when the boys are behind and the brakes are going against them, tell them to go in there and win one for the Gipper." I don't know if he ever said that to Knute Rockne. It doesn't matter. You tell them to go in there and win it. But my favorite is the one with Doris Day called The Winning Team. And it's about the pitcher, Grover Cleveland Alexander, one of the great pitchers in history. In fact, he was rated in a poll not long ago as maybe the 12th best baseball player in history. Played right on down until the 1920s, but he had epilepsy. And it was made worse by being hit with a baseball, and he began to have terrible seizures. But so taboo in those days, actually, was epilepsy that he preferred to let people think he drank. But he made his way and then fell out of baseball, regarded as a drunkard, but was brought back by his friend Rogers Hornsby. And in the movie, he's on the Cardinal team in 1926, and he's pitching for them. And he comes up, this is in the final game of the World Series, with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and all the greats. And he wins that game. And all through this, his wife has stuck with him, the winning team. And so he and Nancy Reagan became the winning team. He had been elected the president of the Screen Actors Guild in the late 40s, the very time that Hollywood was under pressure about communist. And Nancy Davis called him, and she said, "I'm being called to Washington to be investigated." And he said, "What's your name?" She said, "Nancy Davis." "Yeah, I've got it here on this list." "Well, if you look on that same list, there's another Nancy Davis. She's the one who's a communist." Reagan took care of it, and they became the most marvelous of couples. He always called her Mommy. And on his presidential schedule, he would mark 5 o'clock, big red line, home to mother. He went around the country. 1950s, he had a contract with General Electric. He presided over their General Electric theater on television. But he would give 16 speeches a day. And not just to the CEOs, but to ordinary Americans. And he came to believe that they were convinced that they were just like the founders of our country, self-reliant. They didn't need a big government. They didn't need high taxes. They were willing to fight for their country. 1964, when Goldwater ran for president, Reagan gave an electrifying speech. Financial support poured in, and he was elected governor of California. And as governor, he took right on these radicals on campus, walked right up to one of them and said, "Boy, you are a Tarzan movie all by yourself. You've got long hair like Tarzan. You walk like Jane, and you smell like Cheetah. Well, that made for good press. And 1968, he thought he might have a chance at the presidency, but he didn't. 76, tried again, but didn't. But 1980 was the perfect moment, and he became president. And in his inaugural address, he told the American people, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. Now, he remains controversial as a president. Most presidents who do big things are controversial. And he did big things. We had this double-digit inflation. He, through his economic policies, brought that inflation down. Now, it was called Reaganomics at first, and his opponent in for the nomination, George Bush, called it voodoo economics, in which you can cut taxes and still have revenue coming in. Well, it worked for a while, and when asked by the press whether or not his economic policy was working, Reagan said, well, it must be, because you boys and girls don't call it Reaganomics anymore. It's just economic policy. He was a master with the press. Now, many of them never liked him. They certainly didn't like his policies, but he was a master with them. And he was a master with the American people because he spoke the values and views of a large number of ordinary Americans all over this country. That government needed to be reduced. Welfare programs like Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, those were a fundamental safety net. But there were other programs that could be reduced. And the economy began to boom. And when the economy booms, a president is popular. And in 1984, he won 49 states. Only Senator Mondale's state of Minnesota, and that by a very small margin, went to Mondale. So that's proof that from Maine to California, Reagan was popular, and people believed his programs worked. But he wasn't there just to restore the economy, just to try to bring back more limited government. He had foreign policy values, and those policies were based on this belief that America is unique, America is the bastion of truth and the bastion of freedom. And he was not afraid to call the Soviet Union an evil empire, for communism rests upon the denial of one of the most basic of human rights, the right to property. And he took it on. Also took on Libya. It was a terrorist nation. Few American jets blasting into it, and Gaddafi faded into oblivion. And Grenada. Hostages were taken there, American medical students. He sent in the U.S. troops, and that was the last time that happened. Those hostages were freed, and Americans were becoming proud. He went to Berlin, and he stood there with Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was talking about opening up the Soviet Union, making it less repressive. And Reagan just challenged him and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And when Reagan stepped down in 1988, our oldest president, when he was elected, when he stepped down, this country was proud again, and even his harshest critics among historians say that he restored the confidence of the American people, and more than that, he restored their belief in the presidency of the United States. Now, I think Reagan was shaped by the values of Hollywood, by the roles he played. And he translated all those good values of Hollywood into one of the most successful presidencies in our country's history. Not bad for a boy from Illinois. Not bad at all.